The unthinkable happened today. The World Trade Center, both towers.
There was a huge explosion sound. Everyone came out.
And I got up to my window. I live in Battery Park City, right next to the Twin Towers. And I looked up, and the side of the World Trade Center.
When a massive explosion, highlighted by an equally massive fireball, knocked me off balance as the building shook.
So often in the past, we've been able to say it could have been worse. Tonight, this time, it's hard to imagine how.
We got about halfway to my place, which was around Canal Street, maybe Houston, when we heard crackling noises and behind us. So we turned around to see the first tower coming down.
This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there.
And it just seemed like it was getting uglier and uglier, and you were getting more and more frightened.
First of all, good evening. This is a tragic day for our country.
Tuesday, the 11th of September, 2001.
We have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism.
This day, referred to as 9/11, was a series of 4 highly coordinated terrorist attacks by the Wahhabi Islamist terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, against the United States. 19 members of Al-Qaeda terrorist network were responsible for the deaths of 2,977 lives on this one day. That's 2,977 families that never get to see their loved ones again.
We have a report of a plane crash somewhere in the area of the Pentagon. We're trying to get further.
Today we remember those we lost on that day at the World Trade Center in New York, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and the Pentagon. Please join me in a moment of silence in honor of those who were lost. Some of you know this. I was here at Womack that fateful day. I was serving as chief resident for the Womack Family Medicine Residency Program. I can still remember that day precisely. I was in clinic. I had finished my second patient encounter of the day and went to the back to look for the preceptor at about 0900. Finding no one in the preceptor room, I sought out the residency director in their office in the back hallway. As I rounded the corner, I saw many people gathered in the break room as I went to the residency director's office. Not finding him there, I headed back towards clinic. That is when I caught a glimpse of the World Trade Center North Tower and the smoke. I asked what happened, and that is when someone said a plane hit the tower. I recall watching with awe and everyone being in stark silence. Then it happened. The second plane hit the World Trade Center South Tower at 0903. We all knew right then that this was no accident. It couldn't be. 34 minutes later, the third plane hit the Pentagon, and we all knew we were at war. I went back to the clinic and I saw a few more patients that had already arrived for their appointments. But by late morning, the patients stopped coming. Fort Bragg changed that day. Fort Bragg had been an open access post and started restricting access immediately after the attacks. Armed soldiers began stopping and checking vehicles. This immediately led to an 8-hour delay to get on post that lasted for several days before the wait times decreased to a few hours. We sent some residents home that night, but I and several other residents stayed. We were doing night float, and those night shift workers could not get on post, so we stayed. We were not alone. Many staff from all across the organization had to stay in the building to take care of the inpatients. I stayed for 3 days until gaining entrance to the post became manageable. Several others did as well. We relied heavily on those residents and staff that lived on post to continue caring for our inpatients until the gate situation improved. The mission came first. Fort Bragg leadership identified facilities on post that were designated as mission essential areas and assigned soldiers to guard those assets with all available means. Womack was one of those facilities. Shortly after all this took place, the United States military response to the attacks began. Holding true to our rapid response reputation, our Special Operations Forces were dispatched to the forefront of the campaign in the months following the attack. Fort Bragg officials started seeing a spike in people joining and rejoining the Army. Eventually, Fort Bragg started deploying troops to Afghanistan and continued to do so throughout the 20 years to come. Obviously, these deployments to Afghanistan culminated the way they began. Soldiers from Fort Bragg were the first into Afghanistan, and on August 31st, 2021, the commander of the 82nd was the last soldier to leave, an appropriate ending to our involvement in Afghanistan. Today we choose to remember because we swore that we would never forget. Following after me will be the accounts of a few of our Womack staff members who have volunteered to share their stories about 9/11 and the impact it had on their lives. They are the living echoes of that fateful day. Please take some time, listen, remember, and reflect.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, I kissed my wife and 2-year-old son goodbye before leaving my home in southwest Washington, D.C. for the brief Metro Rail ride to the Pentagon. When I arrived at 8 a.m., I met my supervisor, a Navy officer, leaving his post as the overnight duty officer for the news desk inside the Navy Office of Information. He passed on information regarding an assignment. That particular office contained a wall of televisions that are used to monitor local, national, and international news, particularly as it pertains to the Navy. Sometime between 8:30 a.m. and 9 a.m., a coworker directed my attention to the desktop television that was in our outer office, and I watched in horror as a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. I left the office, shaking my head at the image of the stricken World Trade Center, and I decided to get a cup of coffee to jumpstart my energy. On the way out of the office, a coworker suggested that the World Trade Center incident could in fact be a terrorist act, a suggestion that I at that time dismissed.
I lived in New York City. I was working for an investment bank at Goldman Sachs. I lived in Greenwich Village, which is about a mile and a half from my office in Wall Street. My office was across the street from the World Trade Center in One Liberty Plaza. So I was on the 49th floor of One Liberty Plaza when the first plane hit. We heard the explosion. It shook our building. It literally set off our alarm system. And so my assistant said, "What was that?" And I said, "That was an explosion." And I used to be in counterterrorism when I was in active duty military. And so she said, "Was that our building?" And I says, I don't know. But about that time, we saw debris raining outside of the window in our peripheral vision. So we went into my office where the windows are. My office looked directly north, and to the left of as we're looking through our window, you could see the North Tower and the big gaping hole that was on the east side of the tower there.
When I originally found out about it, I was here at Womack. Family advocacy at one point was on the 3rd floor. I had just come back from lunch, and I noticed people were standing around the television in the lobby, and it was a picture of the Twin Towers, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, there's a fire, how did that happen? And then as I was standing there, all of a sudden I saw this plane. The first thought was, wait a minute, Manhattan has rules about you can't fly below a certain level, and then all of a sudden it hit the other Twin Tower.
From my office on the 4th floor of the B ring, I turned to look out of the window toward the C ring when a massive explosion, highlighted by an equally massive fireball, knocked me off balance as the building shook.
Looks like it went in the Pentagon. Hear that? Yeah, stop all departures. Yeah, went in the Pentagon.
I heard screams in the office and someone shouted, "We are under attack." I've been looking around for something to use as a weapon, thinking that those responsible for the blast had somehow breached security and made it inside the Pentagon.
Okay, we have a 335. Registration 335.
My assistant went and looked on the internet and said, there are, the internet's saying a plane hit the building. So we started evacuating. Now, our alarms are going off, our elevators are blocked, so we have to take the stairs. And so as we're going down the stairwell, it's getting slower and slower because more and more people are filling the stairwell from lower floors. So it took us about 20 minutes to get down to the street level. Once we did, there were about 5 of us total on my floor. Did a little head count. And I was the senior guy, so I said, look, let's walk to my place. I'm in the village, it's about a mile from here. And we got about halfway to my place, which was around Canal Street, maybe Houston, when we heard crackling noises and behind us. So we turned around to see the first tower coming down.
I have a call back for 8662. Negative K, nothing further, just see the cabbie on the corner.
And it just seemed like it was getting uglier and uglier, and you were getting more and more frightened. I remember feeling like this is crazy, and just how is this possible? At the time I was married, and I remember my husband was taking a bus up to New York for a reunion of people he grew up with. I dropped him off. Next thing I knew, an hour later, he's calling me to say the bus was back because all the traffic on I-95 was told to go back. No one was being allowed to go up there.
And at that point, we're thinking, oh God, this is just getting more and more surreal by the minute, you know. As we were walking, we could hear people with radios and televisions on, and I heard news reports talking about plane hitting the Pentagon. And I thought, oh, that's stupid news. They're now exaggerating these things and inflating this thing into a much worse process than it actually is. Turns out, yeah, it was true. You know, it did hit the Pentagon.
The employees inside the Navy Office of Information raced out of the space and down the passageway stairs to the outside. While exiting the Pentagon, a cloud of thick black smoke was visible to our right, and it stretched skyward for what seemed like miles. At the I-395 side of the interstate, I attempted unsuccessfully several times to contact my wife via cell phone. My coworkers and I were joined by fellow Pentagon employees from other officers who were searching for any bit of information regarding the terrorist attacks on American soil. Several agonizing minutes later, I was able to contact my wife to let her know that I was not hurt and that I would be calling her every hour to assure her that I was safe. Employees were scattered on the north side of the Pentagon, awaiting an official word on the next course of action, but it never came. Most employees went home, while others decided to remain at the Pentagon to see what they could do. I chose to remain at the Pentagon because I had been in traumatic situations before and believed that my training would be an asset to the first responders. The firefighters continued fighting the raging fires that continued to produce thick black smoke that stung the eyes and choked the throat. One employee sat stunned on the grass as tears and sweat fell through shards of glass and pieces of rock that were embedded in his face. He was oblivious to the blood pouring from the gash in his forehead. The man also seemed oddly at peace. Shortly after, two paramedics ran over to him and began treating his wounds.
We'd actually got back to my apartment before the second building came down, and I saw that one on television. I let my colleagues use my telephone and internet to try to find transportation home. And then the rest of that day was pretty much glued to the TV, watching, events.
Like, it was just, as I said, a very surreal experience. There were certain milestones that as you grow up, you remember, where was I? And like when President Kennedy was assassinated and Martin Luther King, and that stays with you. And then, something else in between, and now this. This is something that's always with me.
By 6:45 p.m., I was exhausted, hot, sweaty, and covered with soot on my face and dress white shirt. My tie was long gone, and I suddenly remembered that I had not eaten anything all day long. An Army Brigadier General gathered us in a final formation behind the shattered West Wall and informed us that we should go home to our families and pray for America. I walked in a daze across the street to the Pentagon City Metro stop. The Pentagon Metro stop was closed and guarded by soldiers with M16 rifles. I entered the station, awaited a train, and boarded it when it arrived. A fellow passenger, noting my Pentagon badge and sooty clothes, asked if I was all right. I nodded yes as she proceeded to say what a shame about the World Trade Center towers. I answered that it was tragic how they were hit. He then answered, "They are more than hit, my friend. The towers are gone."
None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.